All right, we are live. Gary, you ready? All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to welcome you to Keep Oakland Schools Segregated, ? Part 1, a history of school segregation in Oakland and where we are today. This is the first of a 2 or maybe 3-part series if Director Yee gets his way. My name is Jeremy Gormley. I'm the founder of the advocacy organization Integrate Oakland Schools, which strives to bring a data and research-backed approach to highlighting the need for more racially and socioeconomically integrated schools in Oakland. I'm also a former teacher, education technology professional, and volunteer in Oakland schools. As you're watching this today, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to hear why this topic is of interest to you. And today I'm joined by 3 brilliant minds in the Oakland education space, Derek Tillotson, Brian Stanley, and Director Gary Yee. And I'm gonna let each of them introduce themselves before we get started, starting with Dirk.
My name is Derek Tillotson. I'm an attorney by training. I run a nonprofit, Great School Choices. I'm one of the founders of the State of Black Education in Oakland. And I went to kind of a token integrated school, one of the few Black kids in my upstate New York school. It was like many suburban schools, a high performing school compared to the city schools, a school where pretty much everyone was expected to go to college. But it was one where as a Black kid, you kind of had to check your identity at the door and had to fight for your cultural survival in this. So we want to support the creation of schools that both support kids academically and their families as well as culturally in creating a place where they can really grow into themselves. So that's why I'm here, to try to think about how we can get there.
Thanks, Derek. Brian?
Hi, everyone. Brian Stanley. I'm an Oakland parent. I have 2 boys, one of whom goes to Sankofa. And my other kid went to Kaiser and now goes to a school in Berkeley. I was also the executive director of the Oakland Public Education Fund, and now I continue to work in nonprofits. But I'm an education geek by training. Grew up in Oakland, graduated from Oakland High School. Go Wildcats! Greatest high school ever, rah! So nothing like a little rivalry there, Hungary. So looking forward to the conversation.
And Gary.
Thank you. I was born and raised here in Oakland. I went to Markham, Frick, and graduated from Castlemont in 1962. I came back as a teacher, a principal. I'm on the school board in 2002, and after a hiatus of a few years, I came back on the school board in 2019. And I have 2 grandkids who attend a Cleveland elementary school, and I'm totally excited that Jeremy and Dirk are hosting this because a palpable movement in our community to think about the role of integration, student placement, student assignment, and access to our public schools. And Jeremy and Dirk, you are leading that effort on behalf of the community, and I just am glad to be part of this podcast, or whatever we call it.
We can call it what we want. Perfect. Well, thanks all, and I'm very much excited to engage with all of you in this conversation.
I forgot to show you. This is my yearbook from Castlemont in 1962.
we have a few photos that are some throwbacks that we're excited to show, and as I mentioned, we're interested to engage with you all watching as well. So feel free to throw questions in. We are going to have time at the end to answer some of them. Really, today we want folks to leave with an understanding of how Oakland once confronted the moral issues surrounding school segregation. We'll look at why perhaps it was never fully embraced, and whether that's still the case today. And we're really looking at the historical and the contemporary challenge that school segregation poses. We have a part 2 lined up where we'll look more at what's involved in school integration as a solution. And while it might be obvious, I wanted to start with kind of a definition of what school segregation is. And this is my definition, and I think we're definitely going to have some input from the rest of our panelists on how we would kind of supplement this definition. But at the basic level, school segregation is when different racial groups learn in distinct spaces. This could be between districts, between schools, public or private, or even within schools. And this is dangerous because, for one, in a country still dealing with racial divisions and racial subjugations, there is a potential psychological harm to society when we send messages about racial hierarchies and replicate practices straight from the Jim Crow era. Brown versus Board of Education made this point exactly, that segregated schools by their nature are inherently unequal. Segregation can reinforce prejudices, lead to conflict, and has almost always fostered inequality. And this last point we don't want to ignore, and we're going to get into a little bit later, that when schools are segregated by race, learning outcomes and educational opportunities tend to be unequal. We'll look at some of the research that has shown how class and wealth is kind of central to this framing. But that framing can also feel insufficient at times because it's arguably colorblind by nature. So even though it might help us through policy solutions, it doesn't necessarily get at the kind of the core moral dilemma. So I want to start with the idea of whether you all think separate is inherently unequal, and if there's kind of a unique way to think about this differently in Oakland's context. And to kind of get at a scenario, if we imagine that each race in Oakland attended a separate school, one school for white students, one school for Black students, et cetera, would this be okay? And Brian, why don't we start with you?
I mean, if that was a legal structure where we said Black kids can only go to one school and white kids can go to another, I believe the lawyers on the call would have their heads explode because that would clearly be illegal. But I do think currently, as designed, our system allows that. And there are many schools all over the country which are 95+% Black or 95+% Latino or 95+% white that are okay schools or great school or pretty good schools. I think so. So if that is a result of the structure of how people choose to enroll in schools, I don't think the composition of the school should be determinant of whether or not the school is a good school where people can get what they need. Now, that being said, because we use race as a proxy so much in this country, right? If you tell me a school is 95% Black in a city like Oakland, I can probably make with some reasonable accuracy a whole bunch of assumptions about the educational experience of kids in that school, right? They're likely to have newer teachers, less experienced teachers. Again, all teachers start as less experienced. It's a career, right? But if those folks are overly concentrated in those schools, we know that causes issues. They may have a new principal, or they may be on like their third or fourth principal in the last 2 or 3 years. That type of leadership instability will cause issues. They may be in communities where there are enormous amounts of violence or inequity or poverty or homelessness or violence and trauma. We know that also impacts what happens in the school. And so it's not the composition of the school per se. That is to say, it's not as if you get too many Black kids in the building, then somehow that school ceases to be good. But it is actually all the ways in which we use race as a proxy to help us better understand the structure of our society, the opportunities, and what folks can have access to and are denied access to. And so that's how I tend to think about that question a little bit. So, and I'm much more curious to figure out how do we interrupt that cycle, then figure out is the key to making a school that's 95% Black a school where every child in there is thriving, simply adding white kids? I don't think that's quite it. I think we certainly need a whole lot more than that easy solution.
Gary, did you want to answer the same question?
Well, you know, the interesting part about it, it wasn't until I'd gotten to graduate school that I realized the impact of residential segregation on segregated schools. So, you know, I just sort of assumed that, you know, I mean, I knew my father had purchased a home sort of semi-illegally in East Oakland in 1953, so we could move out of the Chinatown ghetto in Oakland. And you know, I'm thinking back on it now and wondering, wow, how could he have, you know, taken the chance to do kind of a sneak deal to buy a house on 68th Avenue, so in order for us to have an assimilation this opportunity. So I'm thinking I didn't learn any of this stuff until the 1990s because you know, when my own kids went to an integrated elementary school, Cleveland Elementary School in Oakland, and that I just thought that that's the way schools ought to be. And then I became a prep teacher at Grass Valley School, and Grass Valley was pretty integrated at the time up by the zoo. And I'm thinking that's the way schools ought to be. And then I realized more in 1990 that it wasn't, that there were policies and practices in the city that actually intentionally restricted or benignly restricted, you know, and we're going to be talking about that more, you know, where people had a chance to go to school. But I was still a proponent of neighborhood schools, even as charter schools were coming out to the fore in 2000. I felt like charter schools were somehow interfering with the notion of neighborhood schools. And then I've come to the place now in this recent term on the board where I've realized that actually our own policies around student placement have led to a kind of hyper-segregation, not just segregation, but hyper-segregation that really doesn't do any of us any good. Even if the school is an all-Black or all Latino school, does it really serve the purpose of the public good of living in an integrated city, integrated community? And even if you have schools that are high-performing, like Lincoln and Chinatown, does that really do those Chinatown kids any service by being so-called well academically educated, but not knowing anything about the larger city and the large community that they're living in?
Yeah, it's a really complex question, ultimately. Obviously, to me, the separate and unequal place is really, is it unequal? And is it based on racial hierarchy? The first school I actually worked with and helped starting here was West Oakland Community School, which was a school designed by Black folks for Black kids in West Oakland, modeled after the Panthers Community School. I don't think people would call the Panthers Community School or Howard University segregated because they come from a place of group power, creating their own institutions. I would say, as Brian did, that 99% of the time when you see all Black and brown schools, those schools will be under-resourced for the needs that exist. They'll have instability. Those kids will tend to be struggling. And 99% of the times when we have these separate schools, they are there for racial hierarchy and to maintain the caste system that's existed from time immemorial. Though I would say, as a Black kid, it would have been important to me to have a school that was more culturally affirming. I do think integration is a good overall in terms of a system where we live in an integrated world. But I think it's hard often for cultural minorities to get a culturally affirming school when it's led by folks that don't look like them, haven't had the experience that they've had, and may harbor their own feelings about who's best and who's good at what. So I do think that's the real challenge within some of this is really, you know, how do we get both? How can we culturally affirm and provide high quality academics? And as Gary said, I think anytime we're hyper segregating kids and we're getting these super high needs kids all pushed together, and then just down the street we have a whole nother set of kids that are not so high needs and much more better resource schools, that does not make much sense from a system that talks about equity. It makes sense from a system based on racial caste, but it doesn't make sense from a system based on equity. And I think we wanted to kind of talk and transition in some of the history of where we came from, which I think is important to inform this work, because I think what we'll see as we go through it is there's really been ups and downs in this push for racial equity and integration or desegregation. It's not one long moral arc that's moving smoothly towards justice. It's a jagged arc that kind of goes up and down and reflects really the conflicting, psyche of America in some ways, where we like to talk about equity and fairness and opportunity, but when it comes down to our individual actions and choices, and even how we structure government and opportunities are allocated, is that the way that things actually play out? Do we want to talk some about history and move to some of those slides, Jeremy? I don't know.
Yeah, and I just want to echo your point. I think it is a difficult question to talk about whether separate is inherently unequal when we never achieved separate and equal. So it is hard to kind of get away from that framing. But yeah, Dirk, did you want to start us off with a few points? We want to highlight some aspects of how Oakland has faced this issue in the past. Really, in the 1960s and 70s, I'd say, is when the last time that Oakland faced this head on and was kind of at the verge of tackling this on a kind of a system level. But Dirk, can we just set us up on some of the events leading into the 1960s that set up some of these discussions around school segregation?
Yeah, and I'm going to even take it even further back. 1871 was when Oakland Unified was officially desegregated. There was a case where Oakland Unified accepted minority children based on the 14th and 15th Amendment. So 1871 was when we said we were actually going to be integrated schools. It's 2021 right now, and we're still having this conversation. So I think that's important. And so let's look at, as Gary said, I think the redlining piece is like, none of the way things are set up right now is by accident. Everything that we see right now is actually the result of government policy. People's choices play into those policies, but these policies, redlining, basically established where Black and brown folks could live. You couldn't get a home loan if you were in one of these areas, and basically, so white folks lived in the non-redlined areas. Redlined areas were assured for Black and brown folks, including Asian people. When you look at where we were redlined in 1937, where we could live, you can look at those racial census tracts today, and it basically looks the same, except the lake has a little more diversity around it. It's basically the same. And when you look at school quality maps on top of these, you'll see the low-lying flatland areas have generally low-performing schools. The hills have generally high. When you look at air pollution, when you look at absentee rates, when you look at asthma, when you look at gunshots, when you look at murders, when you look at any determinant of social or academic health, they correlate very closely to these redlining maps. These redlining maps created our separate and unequal housing situation. And right now, we tend to do enrollment by neighborhood. So that separate and unequal housing becomes separate and unequal schools. And it wasn't just redlining that set this stuff up. Urban redevelopment is another piece of Oakland's history, and really almost every city's history. West Oakland was the Harlem of the West Coast. It had a thriving center that was demolished in order to create freeways, in order to create the post office, in order to put the BART in. These were thriving Black places that then those Black folks were displaced for these public works projects that ultimately didn't benefit the neighborhoods. They brought folks, created easy ways for folks from the suburbs in subsidized housing that the US government set up for white folks in the suburbs to get to city centers, to get to San Francisco, to get across the state, across the country. These were not built for us. They were built on top of Black folks, adding pollution, adding environmental hazards right through the middle of neighborhoods. When they built the BART, there wasn't a single Black tradesman hired to work on the BART project. So not even Black folks getting the economic benefits of it. So the neighborhood is cut up. Black folks are displaced. And that has a lot to do with kind of some of the housing trends that we see in Oakland. You know, Oakland used to be a white city, like many cities. And as we look through the kind of history of cities in the United States, the federal government took a very deliberate push to build suburban housing, to subsidize that. It was reserved for white people. And then Black folks kind of came into some of the urban areas for certain jobs. They were all concentrated in certain areas. You can look at fewer than 9,000 Black people lived in Oakland in 1948. It was over 80,000 in 1960. And you can see the white flight kind of taking place within that situation. So again, Oakland was changing. It was becoming more Black, less white. And we'll see just the way that plays out a little bit in the way we set up our schools, which I think Jeremy's going to introduce some.
Yeah, thanks, Dirk. And one other thing to just point out, as Dirk mentioned, is because of the racial segregation and because of our history and to a large degree today still assigning students to schools based on where they live, we have kind of a baseline going into the 1960s of how segregated our schools were at that time, and a large percentage were. Only 19 out of 66 elementary schools were in kind of quote unquote racial balance. At this time, it was mostly looking at concentration of white students versus concentration of Black students. And you had a little more of kind of desegregated environments in the upper grades based on the nature of those kind of attendance zones. But as I mentioned earlier, the kind of the main event that led Oakland to kind of reckon with school segregation was the construction of Skyline High School's attendance boundaries, which kind of was first discussed in 1961. And Skyline's boundaries were seemingly the first intentional drawing of boundaries. Some could argue whether it was intentional or not, that resulted in a largely white school. And there are even quotes that it was labeled a bastion of bigotry that sat kind of at the top of the hills. The NAACP were big players in calling out the racist nature of the boundary. And you began to see packed board meetings to attack the plan, and there were threats of lawsuits for a number of years because of this. Many people were calling for kind of a more traditional hills to flatlands boundary that were really in place, at least at the high school level leading up to this. There were multiple justifications for keeping the Skyline boundary, and I think this is where it's interesting to think about the similarities with today. Folks said that it would eventually be heterogeneous, that modifications would be too costly or disruptive for other schools, that it was really not the school's responsibility to think about school segregation, that it really was the way the neighborhoods were arranged. So there are interesting points here that really kind of resonate today, and I'd love to hear Gary, starting with you, how you kind of think about this episode and what we can draw from it.
Thanks, Jeremy. As I said, I really didn't pay much attention to this until 1991, when I went back to grad school and I made my dissertation kind of a history of the Oakland school leadership, and I came across the Skyline High School boundary issue as one of the seminal moments because it coincided to a large extent around Brown versus Board of Education and efforts to the federal the federal direction to examine school desegregation and the increased attention to a minority student population. But I appreciate this opportunity, and I wrote out a little thing for this because it became very powerful to me because of the way you set it up about segregated schools and integrated schools. So here it goes. Ironically, the set of elite schools in the hills in 1960, not only Skyline, but Joaquin Miller and Montera did become integrated, become integrated after 1970. Today, Skyline, Montera, and Joaquin Miller are all considered diverse, open enrollment schools serving an entire swath of students from every East Oakland neighborhood. Open enrollment increased integration into those hill schools, but it also increased segregation in the flatland schools by allowing for white flight. And I want to just talk about that from my own personal experience. For example, in Castlemont in 1960, when I attended, was actually multiracial with students from the hills to the flatlands. When Skyline opened, Castlemont lost most of its white population from the hills, but Castlemont still had sufficient white students who lived in the flatlands, mostly immigrant Europeans who worked in the canneries or worked in East Oakland at the General Motors assembly plant that is now Eastmont Mall, to be considered an integrated school. And I have evidence of that in my school yearbook. But that changed rapidly in the 70s as Skyline realized it didn't have enough students to fill its student population, began to recruit more and more students from East Oakland who had private transportation up into the hills. Guess which students those became? Largely white parents who lived in the flatlands, which were themselves becoming more African American in residential population. So flatland schools serving these families like Markham, Frick, and Castlemont, where I attended, became increasingly black. Looking at Markham, and I asked Jeremy to throw up that slide, looking at Markham, where residential covenants created exclusively white neighborhood schools, you can see this process already beginning. When I started in third grade, I was the only non-white student in my class, but by 1957, we had 2 Asians, me and a Filipino, 2 black kids, and 2 Latinx kids. Now, it looks like there's more Latinx kids there, but actually they were probably either from the Azores or Portuguese who worked in canning and some of the other logistics jobs or in farming in the area. Residential segregation covenants were loosening by the middle 1960s, and integration was starting, and white families began to look for other options, leaving schools like Markham a good option for minority families moving in, but the hill schools became the options for white families, and by 1970, Markham was nearly all black. So you can see the shifting population in that single school. As Skyline became more integrated, many white families chose other options. For example, Bishop O'Dowd, Head Royce, St. Mary, districts like San Leandro, Castro Valley, and Berkeley began to recruit students, and guess who those students were? Over time, Skyline and Montera and Joaquin Miller did become more diverse and integrated, but they left other flatland high schools and middle schools and elementary schools with fewer and fewer white students. I call this the vacancy chain, where the elements, the effect of some schools have impact on the schools which are sending kids. What I have learned through this discussion and working with Jeremy and Brian and Dirk is that any school attendance strategy which operates within a residentially segregated city will lead to segregated schools somewhere, whether or not there is parent choice. In Oakland, we have schools which have become integrated because they serve integrated neighborhoods. For example, Cleveland School and Sequoia School. We have some which are integrated as a result of choice, and Kaiser was one example of that school. At the same time, we have hyper-segregated schools because they serve segregated neighborhoods, for instance, Prescott, and others which have become hyper-segregated because of that same parental choice policy. For instance, Horace Mann, or Markham itself, or other schools in gentrifying neighborhoods, such as Sankofa. Skyline's history shows that neither neighborhood boundary decisions nor school choice can by themselves create quality integrated schools across the city, but they can affect individual schools. But we as a board aspire integrated schools, quality integrated schools for all of our children without balancing fundamentally opposing public and private priorities, which is the dilemma that this series hopes to address. Still, integrated schools and integrated neighborhoods is something to be treasured. In our board policies on school assignment and enrollment and the enrollment pilots are public expressions of our commitment to integration. A district of quality integrated schools is my own personal vision for Oakland Unified in the 21st century. And hopefully this series will help inform our community and bring other advocates and demonstration projects to the table so that we can collectively envision integration as a goal that contributes to the historic patterns to disrupting the historic patterns of systemic racism and inequality that people like Dirk have been lobbying for us to pay attention to over the time that I've known him.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. That I think you covered a lot there, and one thing that I want to pull out from it, as you were talking about some of the changing demographics and the structures that in the 60s students and families were operating under when they were making some of those choices, was the idea that starting in the 60s, that you no longer necessarily had to go to your neighborhood school, and that was because of the introduction of open enrollment. And we saw the first introduction of open enrollment starting kind of shortly after the Skyline controversy. Right. And the idea was that as many cities, primarily in the South, kind of opposed the idea of desegregation, they wanted some sort of freedom of choice plan, or some sort of way to make sure that, okay, we're not being forced into a specific school, and we're not using vouchers to fund all white schools or segregation academies, but we do want to highlight individual choice. Now, one of the issues with that is the individual choice can result in racially separate schools. Brian, I'd love to hear your thoughts in Oakland if there's this idea that choice is this third alternative to both segregation and desegregation, and can we talk about school segregation or desegregation in Oakland without tackling the idea of choice because of how long it's been essential to our system?
Yeah, that's a good that's an excellent question. I think the short answer is in the olden days, Oakland choice was in many cases, if the school still had space on the first day of school and you could get your kid there, then you can enroll in that school. And now obviously it's much more sophisticated with algorithms and formulas and computing and all sorts of things that no one imagined back in 1969, 1970. But we like to act as if the idea of school choice is new, when in fact actually it isn't. And if you zoom out a little bit, when Oakland's enrollment dropped from 60,000 kids to 58,000 kids, I'm sorry, we lost about 10,000 students, between 1969 and 1970. Those are folks exercising choices, right? We saw increases in private school attendance. We saw increases on district transfers. In fact, part of the reason why some of the schools were built in the 60s up in the Oakland Hills to try to keep those families in Oakland, because those families were requesting inter-district transfers over to Berkeley in order to send their kids to Berkeley schools, because they didn't want to send their kids down the hill to whatever schools were down the hill from their house. So, so on one hand, there's always been school choice. I think the question is, choice for whom, and choice under what conditions, right? We know under No Child Left Behind and the federal laws that came in the early 2000s, actually before that, you could choose a different school if the school you were assigned to was a failing school as determined by the federal government's testing assessment programs. So no, I don't think it's possible to go back to what is norm in many other communities, I should say this, around the country, where you go to the school down the street. It doesn't matter if you want to, the school down the street is a school you go to. And that's true over large swaths of the country. But in Oakland, that's not the system we have. I think it would be pretty hard to tell parents you have to go to the school across the street from your house if that's not what you want to do. And in fact, many of the schools, when they sort of talk about this is who we are as a community, they talk about their specialized programs, they talk about different services, they talk about different academic things. And so it's important, I think, to just be mindful that I think it's hard to walk this back. And so the question becomes, how then do you either have to factor in more variables into the system by which students are assigned, students who choose to opt out of the school in their neighborhood to another school, you then have to change that variable mix, or you have to constrain the number of choices to say you can only choose these 5 schools or these 12 schools or whatever it is. But that, I think, will be the only way if you're really trying to wrestle with how you balance this. I guess the last point is, these are all trade-offs. That it can be easy to believe. I think the comfortable place to be for lots of folks is it is morally right, therefore it should happen. But implementing morally right policy, particularly in education, it is a technical, it is complicated, it is sticky, there is disagreements, there is conflicts. We're trying to navigate the scarce use of public resources. Everybody can't get everything that they desperately want, because some of those things are in conflict with each other. And so it does seem like this really is the deeper conversation Oakland has never resolved, because it's hard.
Yeah, Jeremy, let me just jump in just for a second on this, because and it really goes back to how you prompted me to go back into my own life, in this story, because I was essentially integrating an all-white school in 1950, and I didn't even, I didn't realize it, but the requirements for assimilation at that time meant nobody's teaching anything about Chinese culture or history. It's all in English, and you take it or leave it. And I was fortunate to make it through there because that was the commitment of my family. But I got to thinking of the black families that are in that photo. The black families coming into that neighborhood are thinking Markham is this great school because it's basically got all these white kids in it and a couple of Asian kids, so it's going to be a good school. They're thinking about maybe instead of going to Markham, but going to Joaquin Miller, probably is not in their range of view, because Markham was considered an okay school. I mean, I don't know if I'm telling that story right, Brian or Dirk, but that's my guess of when you say a nominally integrated school, Dirk, that's a white school, and it's going to be better than the all black school that I would have been going to before. So there's a kind of a story there that, we deserve to hear, from you guys, thinking about, that as when you were kids. I just found it super interesting for myself just to reflect on that.
And that's a continuing story I think families describe in the district of kind of, you can go up the hill to a school and you better learn to dance a square dance because they're not playing hip hop and they don't take requests. And if you don't like it, you can leave. And that is the experience many parents have. You gotta change to fit it, to get through there. And you need to fight for your kid within that environment. We have these just the craziest complaints from parents about teachers saying, I can't work with your daughter because she uses hair products that I'm allergic to. Just things like that, where it's just like, what do you know, like, you need to work with this girl. and she's the only Black girl in the class. And you're saying this in the class while she's there, and the other kids are hearing this. Like, what does that say to that young lady? Is the only Black girl in that class?
And I think that's definitely going to be a much larger conversation in our second part as we look at the challenges of integration. We might be striving for desegregation at the policy level, but then integration means something very different, and what that actually means and the challenges that presents.
And Jeremy, just the last point on that.
Sure.
Was that the notion that the policy to help integrate those Hill schools actually resulted in the acceleration of the hypersegregation in the schools where the kids were leaving. And
right.
So finding a way to slow this process down on the one hand and speed up the process on the other hand is the kind of the competing the policy demands that Brian was addressing to begin with, or was sharing to begin with.
So yeah, let's transition to talk about some of the. So we mentioned how this idea of open enrollment and choice just started becoming central to Oakland's policies in the 60s. By the 1980s and 1990, open enrollment was having the effect that over 20% of kids were leaving flatland schools to try and get spaces elsewhere, and segregation wasn't really confronted in the same way that we saw it in the 60s. It was brought up occasionally. There were state guidelines to say that cities in Oakland, or sorry, cities in California needed to present some sort of plan to desegregate. That gradually ended, and we continued to see segregation levels almost stay the same as various other reforms were tried. But let's look at what's kind of keeping that in place today, which, as I said, is kind of a continuation of some of those structures that were introduced in the 60s. And I'd love to bring folks in to kind of comment on this as well. So the first thing that I want to highlight is what you were just talking about, Gary, is that we still very much have the idea kind of before open enrollment was introduced, that we want to value the idea that you can go to your neighborhood school, and so Oakland gives a preference to folks who live in the neighborhood, the neighborhood being that attendance boundary of that school. But we see very different patterns of who's actually attending their neighborhood school, and we can get into why that might be in the more wealthy white areas where folks can afford to buy their way into certain schools. And we see much higher rates of families attending their neighborhood school, whereas that is less the case in other parts of Oakland, predominantly the east and west and northeast portions of the city. And then in very much the same way, because we still have neighborhood segregation, who by race is actually attending their neighborhood school. The rates are much higher for white students as they are for other races. So Brian, maybe you want to start us off. We say we value neighborhood schools and neighborhood preference, but who's actually taking part in that, makes me question at least how much that is a value for Oakland.
Yeah, I mean, I think if this is not the normative experience for students, and I don't know, but if we're talking about, the median Oakland student is commuting miles upon miles away from their home to attend school, that either is in a location that is perhaps more convenient for parents to pick them up on the way to work. Maybe it's near other community that they care about. So lots of perfectly reasonable reasons. But I do think the notion, again, I think the notion that sort of the typical American fantasy of we go to the school down the street because that school is filled with kids who live in that neighborhood. My friends are there, right? Like that's what we think of, but that doesn't seem to be true in Oakland. And so I don't know then how do you reset or redefine a different norm? Is it really that your kid just goes to school wherever and your friends are where they're at and that's it and we're cool with that? I don't know. I think for my own kid, we live in West Oakland. He goes to Sankofa, and that would it be nice for him to go to school in that neighborhood? Yeah, it would be nice for him to go to school in the neighborhood, but that wasn't the choice that we made when we sent him up the hill to Kaiser for all the reasons that people in West Oakland send their kids to kids in the Oakland Hills. And that's a whole separate conversation we can have. That's not today's topic. But I do think the cost of that is that there is actually some relational costs there, right? I don't know the kids in the neighborhood. I don't know the parents in the neighborhood. There is a certain dislocation that I certainly experience as a parent, saying, "Oh, who's that kid? I wonder what their story is. I wonder what their name is. I wonder where they're from. I wonder what their family's like." And maybe some of that wouldn't be quite the same if we were all going to school at the local school, whatever it is near my house. So I think this idea of neighborhood school is not something that is an opportunity every kid has. I would also say, as someone just said in the chat, transportation is a devastating issue on this. Even lots of folks simply do not have the option to send their kids all over the city. It is time consuming. When I first worked at the Oakland Ed Fund, our office was way out at Bret Hart. Was that it? Yeah, I think that was it. We only had one car. And so my wife would take the car and go to work and drop off our child there. And so I would just take the bus, like, oh, I'll take the 57. Take the 57, right, from West Oakland all the way across. I mean, let me tell you, it was a test of your commitment. And so again, for lots of families, that's just not a sustainable way. For lots of families, it is. The bus is great. It works perfectly fine. Yay. But for lots of other folks, for tons of reasons, it just doesn't work as an option. And we're not going to move to a district where we're funding busing across the city to get kids from deep east to schools in the west and so on and so forth. So I guess the last point on this I'll make is, Oakland doesn't have enough school-age kids to fill all of its schools to capacity. Just if private schools were wiped out, if charter schools were gone, if there was nothing here but you simply do not have enough kids to be able to meet that, to be able to actually fill all the seats that you have available. And so I do think you're going to end up with you will continue to have some sort of choice system. You will continue to have some sort of system which gives people options to move around. And you will continue to do things that probably will continue to break the neighborhood, the historical neighborhood schooling experience that we all long for, but it's simply no longer, it's probably no longer viable for Oakland. For many parts of Oakland.
Jeremy, I wanted to do a true confessions right now, because as many people know, since about 2010, I've been a strong advocate for community schools, along with Superintendent at the time, Tony Smith. And so the notion of community schools is about how you serve the students at the school, but gradually it became known as part of neighborhood preference, because the language of community schools was a quality neighborhood. So the link between neighborhood and community schools and quality became sort of inferentially joined together. And now I realize that in some ways we may have unintentionally reinforced the idea that walking to school is what we mean by community schools. And I think that that's another policy discussion that we really should debate. But your data shows that the unintended consequence of this, not having this discussion, is that we assume that walking to your school down the block is what we mean by quality, and inadvertently it reinforces the school segregation, which your data shows very well.
Dirk, did you want to add anything? We'll highlight kind of one other policy aspect that I think plays a role in the idea of school segregation. We want to make sure we have time for questions as well, but want to just give you the opportunity to.
Super quick stuff. Transportation, yes. That obviously has differential effects on who has access to different schools. And we see that play out all the time. There's families that are very unhappy with their neighborhood school, but just don't feel like they have an option that we hear from, because they don't have an option to get their kid to another school necessarily. I would also say that looking at just the numbers, when folks say to me that they want to really focus on neighborhood schools and like we should really put that preference forward, you can see from the numbers who benefits most from that and who loses most from that. And so if we're saying we're trying to represent underserved families, those are the families choosing out of neighborhood schools right now. So efforts to restrict their choices are most likely to hurt the families that we talk so much about trying to help. And I'd also say choice by itself is not a panacea. Choice by itself will create a whole set of other problems because our choices are not necessarily just in how we define just for society. We cannot just say open up choice and think that that's going to solve this for us. We have to be smarter about that and think about what are the choices we want to honor and whose choices do we want to elevate. And there's a whole set of non-choosers that are often left in schools of default where nobody chose those schools. And what do we do about those kids? And that's a lot to say, but I just think choice isn't the answer by itself. And if anyone tells you that, you're buying a sack of something that you don't want.
And the other point I'd highlight with the issue of open enrollment and choice, in addition to the transportation issue, is that with an open enrollment system, we are.
Can you find the arrows in the map, actually, Jeremy? We
Oh,
had
yeah.
questions about just like what that actually meant, the shading and the arrows.
Apologies. So the map is the elementary attendance boundaries. These are just district-run schools, and arrows represents the net inflow or outflow of students. So it accounts for students coming in and students leaving and kind of the net impact on each of the attendance areas. So you can see kind of how that is a visual representation of some of the graphs on the left, where you have a lot of outflow in the flatlands in the northeast and a lot of inflow in the northwest sections of the city. It is shaded by the percentage of low-income students in those neighborhoods, where darker is a higher percentage and the more yellow is a smaller percentage.
Do we want to talk about the opposite side of what Dirk had said earlier about that, or Brian, about choice is not the answer by itself? Is quality neighborhood schools the answer for is that the answer when you have residential segregation?
Let me just highlight the second part that of the kind of policies today that we have attributed in some ways to kind of maintaining school segregation. And then I'd love to get into that point, Gary. In addition to the issues we've already talked about with kind of some of the drawbacks of our open enrollment system, which has increased to about over 60% of students taking advantage in open enrollment moves, meaning they're going to some other school. Most of those moves, even though we might think would naturally disrupt the school segregation that might be a consequence of neighborhood segregation, is not actually the case. So by and large, most racial groups are going to schools where their own racial group is already in the majority. And so this graph here is showing that the vast majority are either making segregated or neutral moves, meaning they're going to a school that is no more than either the same or no more than 10% greater of their own race, whereas an integrated move, they're going to a school where their own race is 10% less than what exists in their own neighborhood. So this is another kind of indication that even with open enrollment, where we might be disrupting some neighborhood patterns, we're still operating in a segregative system. And I think the points around how transportation plays into that, yes, but we also have a lot of movement in Oakland, and open enrollment without transportation is certainly an issue, but it isn't stopping students from going to other schools. So curious if there are last minute reactions to this, or we can get into Gary's point as well, thinking about the idea of how neighborhood plays into this.
Yeah, just say, our preferences aren't, we've done some focus grouping with various families. And again, I think there are preferences for own group schools. Sometimes those are expressed in positive ways, and sometimes they're expressed in kind of shielded negative ways about not wanting to go to schools with certain kids. And we hear about, chaotic schools, the danger in schools, kind of code words for Black and brown kids when we hear those in focus groups. So I just say choice. I believe in choice in the sense that we don't have the neighborhood schools we need. And some kids just need different schools, even if their neighborhood school is quality. They want an art school or something like that. But choice by itself is not a panacea, and I'm just going to keep repeating that. Choice has to be controlled if we have values we're trying to actually express through our policies of choice.
Mm-hmm.
Gary, I wanted to give you the space for your comment before I highlighted some of those open enrollment patterns, and then we'd love to get to some of the audience questions.
Yeah, because I think some of the, many of us I myself have preached the mantra that if we had quality schools in every neighborhood, the integration problem would disappear. And over the years, I guess I've really come to a more nuanced and complex understanding of the straitjacket of residential segregation. And so I don't talk about quality schools in every neighborhood as the answer to integration anymore. I believe that it is true, but it is not the only truth.
So one thing that we haven't highlighted yet is the degree that Oakland is segregated today, and what the implications are of that. And I'm seeing some of those questions in the chat, so thought maybe we just start there, and then we have some other questions that we're going to get to. But this is really going to take us into our conversation next time, I think. Why should this be addressed, and how should we address this? Because when we look at, for instance, there is a clear correlation between the difference in school poverty between different races. This is a graph from Stanford University, where they highlight the gaps in school poverty between Black and white students, essentially the average poverty rates in for Black students compared to white students in school. The higher that gap, the more likelihood that you're going to have kind of maintenance of racial achievement gaps. And so while no school has really closed racial achievement gaps, it is less likely that a school district is going to do so if you have large poverty gaps between different racial groups. And so this is something that we'll definitely look at more. And we can see that in California, at least, both kind of Black and Latino students are generally concentrated in high poverty schools, whereas that is less so for white and Asian students. And then one other point to highlight is that compared to the 1960s, where we had a large percentage of each school level unbalanced, we see similar patterns today. 9 out of 76 elementary schools are unbalanced racially, meaning that no racial group is kind of within plus or minus 15% of its district average. This includes kind of the 4 largest racial groups in Oakland: Black, Latino, Asian, and white, whereas in the 1960s, it was mostly looking at Black and white levels. So it's not a direct or necessarily fair comparison, but we can kind of see how, in some ways, we're actually worse off than we were 50 years ago. And then to kind of play off of what the national research is showing us in terms of different racial groups being exposed to varying levels of poverty, in Oakland is no different. And we saw where Oakland fell on the graph here. It's one of the highest school districts when it comes to Black-white gaps in school poverty, and as a result, also has one of the highest racial achievement gaps. And we can kind of see how that has really, over the past almost 30 years, been relatively consistent. Black and Latino students and Asian students, to a slightly lesser degree, are normally in schools with much more low-income students compared to white students.
So I think, one of the things, questions, and I saw this in the chat, so I'm going to kind of answer a chat question and then not quite answer a chat question. I do think for me, there's a real question of, do I have to publish that must be true before we're able to say that a Black child in Oakland will get a good public education wherever they live? Because that feels like a pretty crazy high bar. Does it mean that I have to solve white supremacy before my kid gets a good? Because let me tell you, folks have been working on that for a long time, and some days it feels like we haven't made nearly enough progress. So I do think there is a real question for me of what are the trade-offs? What's the obligation that we have as a city to build a civic institution or public schools that are able to do what they say they're going to do? Again, I don't want to say the bar is low, but whatever the bar is, we clearly aren't getting over it very well or very consistently. It also strikes me that some of this, it's easy. It feels much more comfortable to talk about let's focus on integration, when in fact much of what makes our schools inequitable is actually deep structural system design. I shared this with Jeremy earlier, and he can put it in the show notes. But back in 2015, the Ed Fund helped fund a report on Oakland schools that actually found that half of our high schools were structured such that it was impossible for a child to meet the A through G commitments. A baby can go to Castlemont every day, do what they're supposed to do, get to the end and be like, yeah, A through G qualified, sorry, right? It's the structure of the schools that matter, whether it is insufficient instructional time in middle schools and elementary schools. You take your pick. The data's all there. None of this is a secret. And it's been that way for decades, right? And so some of the end results that we see aren't necessarily the product of poverty alone, right? It really takes, quite frankly, a failing of the system to properly respond to the conditions that we know are absolutely true. We know what's up with the babies. We know the neighborhoods. We know all that. And yet something gets in the way that keeps us from doing the right thing. Whether it's hard, we don't know, we're not sure, we ain't got enough money, we got to reprioritize our assets. But if you told me that what's OUSD's budget, $500 million, almost $750 million annually, somewhere in that neighborhood, that these are the results we're producing, and we throw our hands up and say there's nothing else we can do until we solve white supremacy or urban poverty or structural inequity or racism or take your pick, that answer feels really insufficient to me. I think the analogy I used in our prep call was, every day in Oakland, some mama who just worked a double swing at Target or Walmart or wherever she was working all night, drops her baby off to a building full of educators, loved, fed, and well moisturized. And then when the kid can't read at the end, we say, it's your fault, Mom. If only you had found 5 more hours a day to read with your baby, then they know how to read. And the legit response is, what? are you talking about? So I do think that there's more to it, and I do think that there's more agency that the system has. And again, I'm not knocking, don't hear me knock anybody. It's simply a question, because it's not just the superintendent or just the classroom teacher. This is a civic institution that we've built, and the results we've been getting for decades have really been insufficient. And the question is, what do we want to do about that? Or are those results actually exactly the system that we've designed? And those results are what we're going to continue to get.
And I think evidence, Brian, if we just look at evidence and not rhetoric, the evidence would say this is the system design and this is the system spit out. To the A through G, 683 Black kids entered 9th grade 4 years ago. 206 of those completed the A through G requirements. Latinos, 1,301, 465 are even eligible to apply. When I first moved here in the 90s, 8 Latinx males completed A through G, 0.5 of 1%. 1.3% of Black males completed the A through G. So it was horrible then. I would say that the thing I'd say from that is we can improve these rates. But I think there are structural pieces that are undermining it. But the big piece is really, what do we believe about our babies and what they can do? If 18% of white kids were reading on grade level, you needed to have 5 kids to have one be able to read, there would be a riot. 11.5% of Black kids do math on grade level. It's 65% of white kids. 72% of white kids read on grade level. And the gap's getting bigger. The system is delivering the inequality it was designed for, and I think we really need to think hard. And that's in very real ways. Again, the resource gaps you talked about, Jeremy, I want to put those in context. So Frick 2 years ago didn't have a math or a science teacher in 8th grade. That's not going to happen in one of the Hill schools. And how are you going to do algebra if you didn't have pre-algebra from anyone who knew anything about it? You're setting those kids up for failure, and the system doesn't care enough to fix it, where the system would care enough to fix it in other schools. It would never be allowed to happen in other schools. It can only happen in certain schools. At Roots, before it was closed, they didn't have an ELA teacher. Those 6th graders were going down and working with kindergartners and tutoring kindergartners rather than getting their own 6th grade education. That would not happen in other schools. So part of this is what care do we have for all of the children in Oakland, and how do we set them up for success versus how do we just wring our hands when they continue to fail?
So as a representative of the system and this foursome of respondents, I take what you say personally and soberingly, and I say you're right that we haven't been able to fix this particular issue. But part of it is because, as Brian started in the beginning, there is a contested policy debate, and it has to do with private goods, public goods. It has to do with historic systems that you all have outlined in terms of the residential segregation pattern. It's our own personal beliefs that are in there. But the light that I feel in this particular time, represented by this particular casting, is that the language of integration, you put that out there for me. And when I put out the Board Policy 5116 last year, student assignment, I put the word integration in there because I think without us having this discussion, talking only about quality, only about choice, doesn't get us to the question of the public good that I think we all believe Oakland is about, which is an integrated, healthy, integrated, multiracial city. And so I just really appreciate it. I was saying to somebody in my 60 years in the Oakland schools, this is the first time the word integration has been talked at like we are today. We talk about diversity, we talk about inequality, we talk about inequity, we talk about achievement gaps, but we never talk about integration. So I think it has a place to play. It's not the only place, but it definitely has to be in the mix. And so I'm really looking forward to part two, because I know some of your speakers in part two use the word integration. And I'm glad that you put those two people up there in part two, and I can't wait to hear what they have to say.
Gary, and just only because we have about 2 minutes left, I'm glad you brought up your resolution from the fall. I wanted to just end us on some other initiatives that are taking place as we see this conversation, I think, ramp up across the country. Oakland is certainly doing more, it seems, to highlight this perhaps than it has done in a while. Not sure if you wanted to make other comments related to the pilots that were put in place in the fall, as well as at MetWest and others before that. Is there anything else that you just want to highlight that we can then also get into in our next part around what OUSD is doing to kind of take steps around this topic?
I just wanted to shout out Dirk and the work of the Oakland Reach, because in, I think, 2019 or so, they brought the opportunity ticket out. And that was to take what we assumed was the pecking order of choice and disrupting that based upon what school boards are doing around school closure. So you guys have kind of elevated that whole discussion about how do all these pieces fit together. And I want to just thank you for that. I think that opportunity ticket part in our administrative regulation 5116 was a really a lightning rod for this whole discussion. And thank you for that.
Thank you. Appreciate
and if
it.
those of you in the chat don't know what the opportunity ticket is, ask Dirk or look it up on online.
Perfect. Well, we're going to end there. I want to thank you all for this conversation. We are having part two of this next Wednesday at 12 o'clock. You can look for kind of similar promotions that led up to this event. We hope you all can join us there. This will be recorded and stored on both YouTube and Facebook. And thank you for your engagement. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions.
Next week, who do we got as guests next week?
And next week, yep, thanks, Dirk. So next week, we'll be joined by former board director James Harris, as well as Courtney Martin, a local journalist, as well as an Oakland parent who has an excellent new book coming out, as well as an Emerson teacher, Sydney Dexter, who will be really valuable to speak to kind of the educators' experience around this issue.
And the reason James Harris is so important is he's basically the architect of community schools. So I'm going to be in the chat blasting him about that and seeing what he really means by community schools.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for the chats and the questions. Like, it's great, and we can take this offline as well and just continue the conversation. It's important. There are things that are going to be happening around enrollment. Those can make things better. They can make them worse. They can do things that we're not sure about. And we all need to be involved about making the system work better, not just for our own kid.
And
Perfect.
This will definitely inform the board's decision-making in this coming year, as well as the superintendent's, because 5116 requires administrative regulations to implement student assignment policy that includes fiscal sustainability and integration as public values. So your work and your investment of time in the chat is very meaningful and important to this. Jeremy to do a part 3 because we need it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all.